it is a time for some, careful thinking about what wins elections.
Hillary Clinton sat down with MSNBC's Willie Geist, and there's a number of things I want to comment on here, including Clinton's advice to Democrats, but also her warning about Republicans. So I have 3 clips. First, let's get to her warning here, which I think this is indisputable.
We have to do much more than we're doing now to fight back against this very organized effort to undermine our elections, to put into place laws and regulations that are contrary to fair process, to fair voting. And I worry that still too many people are like, oh, it can't be that bad, or it can't go that far. It's a failure of imagination.
All right, I think Hillary here is right on point. Democrats are not taking Republicans seriously. After January 6th, it was clear that that was an attempt at an insurrection. Now this came out today or last night. Trump's White House passed around a PowerPoint on how to end American democracy. Former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows handed over a trove of pre-January 6th documentation. It's damning stuff. They have a PowerPoint on how they're going to stop Biden from becoming president. Now, obviously, it was not successful, but would you really trust them with another opportunity? Democrats are so incredibly weak, not even just on what they should be doing in terms of certain economic policy and helping people like universal health care and that kind of thing, higher wages, but also just in terms of the basics, fighting Republicans. They can't even do that. They're in power right now, and they can't even do the basics. So Hillary Clinton, I think, is right to warn about that. But now let's get to the dumb stuff. So Hillary Clinton giving advice to Democrats here. Now, look, it's not really her fault. She's, of course, asked about what her advice would be to Democrats. But let me just get into this. So here's the first clip where Hillary is giving her thoughts on what Democrats should do to win.
I think that it is a time for some, careful thinking about what wins elections, and not just in deep blue districts where a Democrat and a liberal Democrat or so-called progressive Democrat is going to win. First of all, we don't know what the state of the map is going to be after all of the redistricting. It appears as though the Republicans in a number of states are doing their best to eliminate as many seats that Democrats can be competitive in. And so we've got to be very clear-eyed about what it's going to take to hold the House and the Senate in 2022. I understand why people want to argue for their priorities. That's what they believe they were elected to do. But at the end of the day, nothing is going to get done if you don't have a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. And our majority comes from people who win in much more difficult districts. And our majority in the Senate comes from people who can win in not just blue states and hold those wins, as we saw didn't happen in Virginia, but can win in more purplish states.
All right. Now, if you're sort of unclear on what Hillary Clinton is saying there, it's going to become a lot more clear in the second clip when we get to Claire McCaskill's thoughts on this. But essentially, she's saying here that in order to win in red districts, you have to be more conservative, more moderate, as they like to say, even though it's just meaning more conservative. You have to be pro-corporate. Somehow that appeals to people. Now, she's right on the point about redistricting. Yes, Republicans right now, that's another issue that Democrats should be dealing with, and that is going to threaten a lot of seats in the House. But look, when it comes to Hillary's advice here, losers can sometimes offer some insight into how to win based on their experiences and what they did wrong. But if your insight is the exact same strategy that you took to lose, then your advice is garbage. If your advice to Democrats is just do what I did and you'll win, but you lost, why would they do what you did when you lost? So she references there Virginia, Terry McAuliffe. Terry McAuliffe was her candidate. That was her candidate, an ultimate corporate Democrat. From New York Magazine here, the Hillary playbook does not work. So Sarah Jones goes on to write, to recap, Virginia Democrats united behind an unpopular Democrat who spent years in public life and ran on not being Trump while failing to offer voters a compelling alternative vision. That strategy didn't work in 2016 when the candidate was Hillary Clinton, and there was no way it was going to work now. While it's arguably true that the GOP remains the party of Trump and that a reactionary lurks behind Youngkin's polite facade, reality does not necessarily dictate voter behavior. Moreover, McAuliffe didn't actually have to try to convince anybody that Youngkin is a reactionary at all. He just had to explain what he, in contrast to Youngkin, would offer to voters. And since he's already served one term as governor, this shouldn't have been difficult to accomplish, yet it was beyond him. McAuliffe offered nothing. Much like these corporate Democrats, no universal health care, no living wage, no higher taxes on massive corporations and the wealthy. It's all a pro-corporate message masked through very vague language. McAuliffe inspired nobody, and he lost. You can't keep betting on the Republican candidate being worse. You can't simply campaign on that guy being Donald Trump. That's not going to work every time. It may work sometimes. It worked for Biden because 4 years of Trump was a complete disaster in the middle of COVID. I really think anybody could have beat Trump at that point. But for the most part, that does not win. What can win and what has worked, let's look at Katie Porter. Katie Porter flipped a Republican district that only ever had a Republican representative. She's the first Democrat in that district, and she's progressive. Backs universal health care, a living wage, actually fights for the working class. Here is a real example of someone that ran as a progressive and won. Whenever you see these people, and I'll get to Claire McCaskill in a second here, whenever you see these people, make these points about how you have to be a moderate or more conservative Democrat to win these red districts, notice how they never use any examples. They may point to, Joe Biden, but again, that was a unique election where I think anybody could have won against Trump. But they have no real examples of something like this happening, where a conservative Democrat flips a deeply red district and holds on to it. But you have to actually speak to voters. The key here is bring out people that don't normally vote. That's the key to Democratic victories, is bring out people that are disillusioned by politics. You have to bring a real message with specifics in terms of how you will help them, especially economically, as so many people are struggling all across the country. But let me get now to Claire McCaskill. So a Democratic senator who also lost her state by being too conservative chimes in on Hillary's comments.
Hillary Clinton pointing this out is really, really a big deal. And I hope that the progressive wing of my party takes it to heart. The power comes from a majority. The majority comes from the middle, because we're not talking about places that are bright blue. We're talking about places where they do care whether or not parents feel like they have any control over their child's school. Forget about what specifically they're teaching. It's about understanding that in these times, parents, and a lot of these parents in the suburbs, women, mothers in the suburbs, came to Joe Biden because he was the candidate of the middle, not that he was the candidate of the extreme. And if we don't get that, if we spend all our time talking about the things that bright blue places want to focus on and not on the things that moderates want to hear, we are not going to hold the majority.
Again, so stupid. So stupid. Doesn't cite any other victory, cites Joe Biden, who, if you go back and, again, obviously I covered that extensively while it was going on. Joe Biden won the Democratic primary because he was being pushed out there as the more electable candidate by the press. They were looking at him, oh, he's been there before. He appeals to both sides. So Joe Biden's the right choice. That fooled enough people where they picked Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders in the primary. Now, as I said, I think regardless, almost anybody could have beat Trump at that point. We're talking about the middle of COVID. We're talking about a disastrous 4 years. People were tired of Trump. They wanted something different. And that's also why they picked Biden. It felt like the safe choice to a lot of voters. They may have liked Bernie more. I mean, you look at, if you look at what ballot measures passed. So in Florida, they passed a higher minimum wage. And in exit polls in the primary in Florida, they supported Medicare for all, even though they chose Joe Biden. In fact, in every state that Joe Biden won, there was exit polling showing that the voters supported, a majority of Democratic voters supported Medicare for all. Yet they picked Joe Biden. So it wasn't because of Joe Biden's policies. They picked Joe Biden because Joe Biden felt safe to them. You can't bet on that in these other races. You can't bet on that when it comes to the Senate or when it comes to the House. You have to actually speak to working class voters, get people out that don't normally vote. That is how you win. And you do that by speaking to their needs. And just one last thing, the idea that Claire McCaskill at the beginning of that clip says, I hope the progressive wing listens to Hillary Clinton. I can guarantee you that's not going to happen. There is no one that is progressive that cares about what Hillary Clinton has to say. So, it's important to revisit these arguments every now and then just to remind people how stupid this shit is. I mean, you have these two losers here that clearly did not learn anything from their loss. Now, people, they have ups and downs in their careers. That's fine. You can have lessons from those careers and spread that knowledge. But in these two cases, Hillary Clinton and Claire McCaskill, they learned the opposite. They lost doing what they are now preaching that Democrats should do. It's completely insane. Agua Pella Barba says, woke politics loses bad in purple districts. So this is something that I actually wish I brought up in that discussion, the Hillary Clinton clips. That, yeah, part of the reason that McAuliffe lost is he didn't have a proper response to the critical race theory bullshit that was being spread by the GOP there. So instead of discussing how, I think one of his comments that blew up was he said that parents don't belong in the classroom. Massive gaffe. You don't say that kind of shit. So yeah, when it comes to, and that isn't, to be clear, nothing is wrong with the actual critical race theory, as that is something being taught in colleges. It's about the response to the GOP bullshit. You have to be able to know how to call that out in a way where you're not hurting yourself in the process. So Terry McAuliffe clearly did not know how to do that and ended up hurting himself. But yeah, this is what all Republicans have are cultural issues. So they will fearmonger about cultural issues, and they're always going to have a certain amount of people that are going to vote for them just because of that. But there are those swing voters on the cultural issue that you can get if you, number one, are able to reject the GOP bullshit on those cultural issues and actually tell them the reality of what's going on. And two, actually offer a inspiring, hopeful message. So Terry McAuliffe, of course, didn't do either of those and lost to Glenn Youngkin.